The absolute worst moment of my life wasn't the day the doctor told me I had cancer. It was 7:35 a.m., May 14th, in room 412 of the City General, when my own mother, Eleanor Vance, looked at my father's spreadsheet and sentenced me to death. You know that feeling when you're 19, hooked up to chemotherapy, and you're terrified? That raw, desperate fear for your life? Well, my fear was instantly overshadowed by pure, blinding shock. My parents stood there, holding a folder thick with medical bills, and my mother, the woman who used to check my forehead for fever, looked me dead in the eye and said the words that will haunt me forever. Let him die. Robert, he's too expensive to save. 5 years later, I was still alive, working 3 soul-crushing jobs to pay off that debt, when a stranger knocked on my door and handed me a check for $93 million. If you think family loyalty means anything, you need to hear this story. If you've ever been abandoned, betrayed, or told you weren't worth the trouble, stop scrolling right now and hit that like button. If you subscribe, you join a community where we prove that life is priceless. I didn't think I had a voice left. The chemo had already started its chemical warfare, stripping my throat raw. But the shock cut through the pain. I managed to croak out one word, aimed directly at the woman who was supposed to be my anchor. Mom. She couldn't meet my gaze. She shifted her focus to the sterile white floor tiles, then back to the manila folder in my father's hand. Robert Vance, my dad, didn't look like a father. He looked like a CEO presenting quarterly losses. He was a man whose entire universe was governed by debits, credits, and profit margins, and his only son had just become the biggest deficit his ledger had ever seen. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. That would have suggested some level of emotion. Instead, he presented the facts with chilling precision, like he was discussing a broken axle that wasn't worth repairing. The numbers are undeniable, Elijah, he reiterated, his fingers stabbing at the cold blue lines of the Excel sheet displayed on his tablet. The specialist radiation, the targeted immunotherapy, it's projected at over $450,000 net. That figure, Eli, is a financial liability we cannot absorb. I looked beyond him to my older brother, Darren, the golden child, the one destined to inherit the entire Vance Auto Shop empire and the flourishing real estate portfolio. He wasn't even pretending to care. He was wearing an expensive, tailored suit, and his eyes were glued to his phone, probably checking the closing price on his next high-end condo. When he finally sighed and glanced up, it wasn't pity I saw, it was sheer, unadulterated irritation. It's basic economics. Colt, Darren said, using the nickname only he used to make me feel small. We're talking about the liquidation of the business, Mom's entire retirement account, and my future, my entire career timeline, for a 65% chance you survive. It's a bad investment. You, of all people, the mechanic, should understand the cost of parts versus the return on investment. I was 19. I had sarcoma, a physical manifestation of betrayal, but the words "too expensive to save" hit harder than any dose of vincristine. The air in room 412 didn't just feel cold, it felt chemically hostile. I was no longer their son. I was a catastrophic line item on a budget they refused to exceed. I remember thinking, this is what it comes down to. The years I spent under Dad's cars. The 60-hour weeks I put in while Darren was golfing with clients. All of it is canceled out by one spreadsheet. My father meticulously gathered his paperwork. His hands, usually stained with motor oil and grease, were pristine that day, as if to underscore his detachment from the dirty reality of my life. He tucked the manila folder under his arm, his exit strategy secure. We're done here. Elijah, he concluded, his voice an echo of finality. We can't risk everything 3 generations built. We're cutting all contact. Don't try to reach us. It's for the best. My mother finally looked at me, and her expression wasn't one of sorrow or regret, but of fear. Fear of poverty. Fear of losing the house she loved. I'm sorry you got sick. she whispered, leaning closer. But sometimes, love means letting go of the things that drag you down. And just like that, they filed out. My father first, the accountant. My mother next, the collaborator. Darren last, pausing only long enough to offer a curt, self-serving farewell. For what it's worth, I hope you beat it. Just do it without us. The door clicked shut, the sound final and absolute, leaving me utterly alone with the sound of the heart monitor beeping a cruel, rhythmic count of my abandonment. In the span of 4 minutes, I was reduced from a son to a financial liability. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the untouched breakfast tray beside me, and prayed to whatever God would listen that the chemotherapy would finish the job the Vance family spreadsheet had started. I wanted to die, not from the cancer, but from the crushing, overwhelming weight of realizing my life was mathematically worthless to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I didn't know then that the man who would prove my value wasn't a doctor or a lawyer, but a quiet, old janitor mopping the floors just outside my door. I didn't know that the cold, calculated cruelty of my family's decision would be answered 5 years later with a truth worth $93 million. But to understand the crushing finality of that betrayal, you first need to understand the toxic soil in which the Vance family greed was rooted. You need to understand how I went from being their dependable son to their disposable asset. To understand why my family could walk away from a hospital bed without looking back, you have to understand the air I grew up breathing. It wasn't the smell of mom's cooking or freshly cut grass. It was the smell of motor oil and money. My father, Robert Vance, didn't just run a business. He ran our family like a well-oiled corporation. Every person had a job, a designation, and a balance sheet. He was the CEO, and the governing document was the Vance family code of the dollar. Affection wasn't a resource. Time wasn't a luxury. Everything was a transaction. And every transaction had to yield a high return on investment. The highest return, the blue chip stock in the Vance portfolio, was my older brother, Darren. Darren was the golden child, the one who dressed sharp, talked smooth, and had that natural arrogance Dad admired. He was the future. Dad poured everything into him, the best private tutoring, the expensive real estate courses, the networking dinners. Darren didn't have a passion for cars. He had a passion for commission checks, and Dad saw dollar signs whenever Darren swaggered into a room. My father would always talk about Darren's potential, his liquidity, his guaranteed prosperity. It was exhausting. Then there was me. I was the grunt labor, the utility player, the essential, dirty secret that kept the whole machine running. I was the one who genuinely loved the shop. From the time I was a kid, the smell of grease and gasoline was my comfort zone. I was the natural mechanic. I remember turning 16. Darren got a shiny new BMW, a necessary business asset, Dad called it, to drive to his college visits. I got a second-hand Ford Ranger and a framed certificate that read, Elijah Vance, 4 years of dependable service. It hung above the time clock in the shop, a constant reminder that I was valued for my labor, not my presence. Dad's mantra was always the same. Darren brings in the big money. You, Eli, you just keep the lights on. I was reliable, easy to manage, and most importantly, cheap. That summer, I worked 60 hours a week, hunched under suffocatingly hot cars, fixing the complex transmission failures Dad or the other guys couldn't figure out. I never complained. I thought that kind of loyalty, that sheer physical dedication, would eventually be enough. I thought it would earn me a seat at the table, maybe even some respect. But in the Vance world, loyalty was just an unbilled expense. My mother, Eleanor, was the silent, complicit partner in this financial madness. She wasn't malicious, but she was desperately terrified of poverty. Her fear of losing the house, of losing the security my father's business provided, was stronger than her maternal instinct. She lived by spreadsheets and savings goals. She was the one who never intervened when Dad favored Darren, who always looked away when I was criticized. Her mantra wasn't about love. It was about risk management. I saw a moment of clarity once, years before the diagnosis. I was 14 and got my arm badly broken in a shop accident, a complex fracture that required expensive surgery and plates. The medical bill was almost $8,000. I was laid up on the couch, bruised and swollen, and I heard my father yelling in the kitchen, $8,000! That's $8,000 we won't see back. Eleanor, we need to be smarter about these things. My mother whispered back, her voice tight with panic. But Robert, he's your son. He's a careless worker. He's an expense. We have to prioritize the assets that provide returns. I lay there listening, the throbbing in my arm nothing compared to the slow, creeping realization in my gut. I was an expense, a careless worker, not a son. That comment, over a simple broken bone, was the ugly preview of the cold calculus he'd later apply to my life-threatening cancer. They weren't just prioritizing assets. They were prioritizing a way of life, a clean, safe, financially secure life, over me. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It was cultivated over 2 decades. They had spent years conditioning me to accept my role as the utility player, the one who sacrificed for the greater good of the Vance bottom line. When my life became a 6-figure number with no guaranteed return, it wasn't a hard choice for them. It was the only logical, business-savvy choice. I wasn't just disposable. I was mathematically necessary to dispose of, simply because they saw me as parts, not family. That's why, when I needed them most, they brought an Excel spreadsheet, not a hug. They calculated the cost of my life and decided it was too high a premium. The headaches started in March. At first, I just blew it off. You know, long days under hot engines, breathing in fumes, squinting at complex diagrams. I figured it was just stress, or maybe I needed new glasses. I kept popping Advil and kept working. The Vance code of the dollar didn't account for sick days. Ever. But the pain got meaner. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a screaming siren behind my eyes that hit me out of nowhere, sometimes making me have to brace myself against a fender just to keep standing. I started getting nauseous. I dropped weight, which I blamed on the long hours and bad fast food. I couldn't tell Dad or Darren because in the shop, weakness wasn't tolerated. It was a liability. I finally dragged myself to a clinic when I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was a Saturday, one of the few days I hadn't planned to be underneath a car, and I spent the whole morning waiting, sweating, terrified not of the doctor, but of the bill. I kept thinking, if this costs too much, Dad's going to flip. The Dr. Ramirez, was calm, maybe too calm. She ordered a series of scans. I didn't tell my family. I figured I'd wait until I knew what I was fighting. If it was simple, I'd pay the deductible myself. Then came the call. Elijah, we need you to come in immediately. Bring someone with you. I brought my girlfriend, Sarah, not my mother. Sarah held my hand when Dr. Ramirez used the words you never want to hear. Soft tissue sarcoma. Cancer. It was aggressive, near a major nerve cluster, and required immediate, specialized radiation and chemotherapy. The world just dissolved into a white, sterile blur. All I heard was static and the word, immediate. When I finally told my family, their reaction wasn't concern for my life, it was financial panic. My mother immediately started crying, but the tears weren't about my pain. They were about the Maplewood house. Oh, God. The deductible. Robert, the insurance won't cover the full cost for City General. What about the specialist? Her fear was visceral, a raw, protective shield around her retirement fund. My father, true to form, didn't come to the hospital until he had conducted a full audit. He arrived not with flowers, but with a stack of printouts and that chillingly organized manila folder. The initial rounds of specialized radiation were brutal and expensive. The insurance company, the great American gatekeeper, fought back, denying coverage for the specific drugs required for my type of tumor. It was a constant war being fought by me, the patient, and my father, the accountant. The day they abandoned me, the day the calculus was finalized, my father didn't come to comfort me. He came prepared. He spread the documents across my small hospital tray table, turning my dinner spot into a cold, hard financial war room. He had highlighter pens, margin notes, and his laminated family asset management plan. "This is the breakdown, Eli," he narrated, pointing to the column labeled liquidity risk. We already had to pull $50,000 out of the shop's working capital for the first week. The next 18 months of treatment, if you respond well, is $400,000 net. If we have complications, if we need the experimental immunotherapy, we're looking at close to $1 million. My heart wasn't beating. It was sinking. "But we have equity in the house. Dad, we can take out a second mortgage." That's when he hit me with the emotional hammer. "And what about Darren? He's closing on his first high-end property. His wedding to Amelia is next year. If we liquidate now, his future is compromised. His potential is collateral damage. He has a guaranteed future. You have a 65% chance." "I have to look at the numbers, Eli." I looked at Darren, who just shrugged, adjusting the cuff of his expensive suit. "It's the smart move. Colt, a gamble on the house is a dumb investment. You get it." My mother, Eleanor, was the executioner. She looked at her husband, not her son, and said the words that defined our relationship forever. "Let him die. Robert, he's too expensive to save." I remember watching them file out. My father, the CEO, my mother, the executioner, Darren, the heir. They didn't just leave the room, they disappeared from my life. They changed the locks, changed their numbers, and moved to an upscale gated community I couldn't afford to drive past. I was alone, staring at the empty space where my family had stood, with poison dripping into my veins, realizing my father didn't love me less because I was sick. He loved me less because I was expensive. That was the true price of the Vance family name. The first 3 days after they left, I didn't want to fight the cancer anymore. I wanted the chemo to win, to just finish the job. Not because I was afraid to live, but because I wanted my father, Robert, and my mother, Eleanor, to feel the weight of their calculation. I wanted them to see that my death would finally prove that some things, like human life, don't belong on a spreadsheet. I was so consumed by the sheer, ugly shock of their betrayal that the sarcoma felt like the easier battle. I just lay there, staring at the empty chairs, the breakfast tray still untouched. I kept replaying my mother's voice. "Let him die. He's too expensive." It felt like they had ripped out my emotional wiring. I was numb, but beneath the numbness was a suffocating, black despair. I knew they'd changed their numbers and moved. I knew they were already erasing me from the Vance financial history. Then, on the 4th day, Miss Gina Morales walked in. Gina wasn't the type of social worker you see in movies, all soft voices and pity. She was tough, mid-50s, with sharp eyes and an absolutely zero-tolerance policy for self-pity. She pulled her chair right up to my bed, closer than my mother had ever dared to sit, and looked at me until I finally met her gaze. "Honey," she said, her voice low and firm. "I heard what happened. I heard your family traded you for a house and a business. You can lay here and let the cancer or the bitterness take you, and you will prove them right. They'll justify their greed forever. Or," she leaned in, "you can get up, fight this poison, and live so well that their entire calculation becomes the joke of the century." Gina knew the stakes because she'd lived them. She told me without a trace of sentimentality. How her own fiancé had bailed the moment her late-stage multiple sclerosis diagnosis came through. His parting shot was that she was a bad investment. Gina's philosophy became my new gospel. The best revenge isn't dying to make them guilty. It's living, succeeding, and living free of their toxic math. She didn't just offer platitudes. She offered a strategic battle plan. She connected me to every resource possible: the hospital's charity wing, specific funds for young adult cancer patients, and legal aid to deal with the insurance denials. Most crucially, she found me ways to work. My survival became a business model built on pure, concentrated spite and resilience. I was determined to pay the debt my father had deemed too large, just to prove I wasn't the financial liability he'd labeled me. The 5 years that followed were a grueling, relentless crucible. The chemo was agonizing. It felt like swallowing fire and rust. My hair fell out in clumps, my weight dropped, and some days the nausea was so bad I couldn't keep water down. But every single day, between treatment cycles, I worked. Job 1, remote data entry, $15 an hour. Typing until my fingers cramped and my eyes burned. I'd set up my laptop on the hospital tray table, the IV pole looming beside me like a sterile gargoyle. While the cancer was poisoning my blood, I was poisoning my eyesight with cheap screen time. Job 2, medical transcription for a clinic Gina knew, $18 an hour. This was harder because I needed concentration. I'd force myself to listen to the doctor's notes, trying to translate complex procedures while my own brain felt slow and fuzzy from the drugs. But I had to focus. Every transcription was a small chip away at the mountain of debt. Job 3, my secret fuel. My hands might have been shaking from the chemo, but they still remembered the feel of a wrench and the texture of metal. I used the money from the first 2 jobs to buy cheap canvas and charcoal. On weekends, when I could force myself upright, I'd set up a small table near the City University campus and sell my gritty, abstract street art. It wasn't just money, it was therapy. It was a visible reminder that my hands were still gold, still capable of creating something valuable, even if they were too shaky to hold a mechanic's wrench properly anymore. I worked 16-hour days, often pulling the IV out just to make a quick delivery or set up my art table, then rushing back for the next round of treatment. The pain was secondary to the shame. I was constantly afraid I'd run into my family, or worse, run into one of Darren's real estate clients, and have to explain why the Vance family's son was selling drawings on the street while wearing a chemo port. The memory of my mother's cold, calculated voice, "Let him die," was the only fuel that never ran out. That memory always stopped me from calling them, from begging for help. I swore I would survive, not for them, but for myself, and for Gina, who believed that my resilience was the only currency that mattered. There were moments of despair. Of course. One night, I was throwing up violently, and the heart monitor was screaming. I wanted to smash the machine, to make all the noise stop. I wanted to quit. But then I'd look over at the sticky note I'd taped to the tiny mirror in the bathroom, a note Gina had written for me. "Your worth is not measured by an Excel spreadsheet." I wasn't fighting for the Vance family name anymore. I was fighting for my own name. Elijah Vance, the man who was worth saving, even if he had to save himself. One remote data entry project and one charcoal sketch at a time. The physical battle was brutal, but the mental battle, the constant need to prove the Vance code of the dollar wrong, was the real crucible. I had become the anti-asset. I had become the self-made survivalist. And the entire time, someone silent was watching. The cancer was a brutal, visible war waged on my body, but the abandonment was a quiet, internal poisoning. In the endless, desolate landscape of my hospital nights, when the fear was highest and the silence was deafening, there was one constant shadow, one unexpected guardian, Mr. Silas Finch. He was the night janitor for the oncology ward, and he became my silent witness. Mr. Finch was old, thin, and moved with the slow, methodical pace of a man who had seen everything and judged nothing. He wore the same faded gray uniform every night, and he smelled faintly of pine cleaner and the stale coffee he drank from a thermos. He didn't know about the $450,000 financial liability I was fighting. He didn't know about the spreadsheet or the golden child heir. He just knew I was the kid in room 412 who was always awake, always on a laptop, even when the chemo had clearly broken me. Mr. Finch never spoke much. Maybe a mumbled, "Good evening, Mr. Vance," or a brief nod, but his actions spoke louder than any sermon. He saw the untouched hospital dinner trays. My nausea was too crippling to eat, and he would quietly leave a protein bar or a pack of salty crackers on my nightstand. He knew I needed fuel for my all-night coding and transcription sessions. One night, I was wrestling with my lifeline, my cheap, second-hand laptop. The power cord had frayed, and I was trying to jerry-rig it with electrical tape and a bent paperclip. I was exhausted, frustrated, and crying silently. Mr. Finch finished mopping the hallway, then paused in my doorway. He watched me for a full minute. Then, without saying a word, he came over, took the cord, and sat on the visitor's chair. He didn't rush. He opened his tool belt, a worn leather pouch filled with tiny screwdrivers and precise wires, far beyond what a janitor should need, and meticulously fixed the charger. When he handed it back, it was sound, stable, and perfectly taped. "You're a mechanic, aren't you, son?" he asked, his voice a low, raspy whisper. It was the longest sentence I'd heard from him. There's a dignity in knowing how things work. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He saw the gold in my hands, the true value that my father had ignored in favor of spreadsheets. But the most profound intervention wasn't the food or the repair. It was the education. One midnight, he returned to my room and quietly placed a stack of books on my tray table. They were worn, library-discarded tomes on intellectual property law and industrial design patents. Beneath the top book, he had left a simple, hand-scribbled sticky note. "Your hands are gold. Son, don't just fix things, own the fix." I was stunned. Why would a janitor, who seemed to live entirely in the shadows, give me books on becoming an inventor? I started reading them between chemo sessions. It was Mr. Finch's silent, profound encouragement for me to look beyond the grease and the charcoal, to see myself not as replaceable grunt labor, but as a creator. He saw the genius in the boy everyone else had dismissed as a costly mistake. The truth was, Mr. Finch wasn't poor by circumstance. He was humble by choice. He spent his nights mopping, observing, and silently helping those the system or their families had chewed up and spit out. He was watching me fight the cancer and the debt with nothing but pure grit, and he was validating my entire existence. A year into my remission, after I'd finally managed to secure a tiny, cheap apartment and was working my 3 jobs full-time, I came back to the ward to thank him. He wasn't there. I asked Gina. She pulled me aside, her face drawn. "Mr. Finch passed away. Eli. Pancreatic cancer. It moved fast. He refused treatment," she said softly. "He told me he'd lived enough. He said his work here was done." I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, staring at the empty hallway where his mop bucket usually rested. I cried that night for the first time in years. I cried for the quiet old man who had validated my worth more than my own blood ever had. I never knew his full story. I never knew that the silent watchman mopping my floor had a secret that would fundamentally alter the outcome of the Vance family's calculated cruelty. I carried his wisdom, owned the fix, and his memory with me through the next few grueling years. I still worked my 3 jobs, but now the debt felt less like a burden and more like a challenge to be conquered. I was surviving. I was fighting. And I was slowly building a life independent of the Vance family ledger. I had no idea that Mr. Finch's final, generous act of observation was still waiting for me, written in a lawyer's black ink. 5 years, 5 years of working 16-hour days. 5 years of instant ramen and cheap coffee. 5 years of fighting off the crippling $200,000 debt that clung to me like a second cancer. I had beaten the sarcoma, but I was still paying the price for daring to get sick. I lived in a cramped studio apartment above a liquor store where the smell of stale beer and desperation was my constant companion. My furniture was mismatched, and my desk was still that folding card table. I was free, but I was living proof that even surviving a life-threatening illness in America can leave you financially crippled. Last Tuesday, the knock came. It wasn't the tentative tap of a delivery guy or the clumsy thump of the neighbor upstairs. It was a precise, professional, insistent rap that sounded entirely out of place on my battered front door. I opened it to find a man who looked like he'd stepped straight off a magazine cover. He wore a tailored Armani suit, the kind that screams, "I cost more than your car," and held a leather briefcase that gleamed under the flickering hallway light. "Elijah Vance?" he asked, his smile professional yet kind. "My name is Mr. Sterling, from Sterling, Thorne and Associates. I need to discuss the last will and testament of the late Silas Finch." I actually laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound that caught in my throat. I laughed because life had played so many cruel jokes on me. I figured this was just the finale. "The janitor?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe, suspicious this was some kind of forgotten medical bill or a scam. "Mr. Finch? Unless he left me his mop and bucket, I think you have the wrong guy. The richest person I know is my brother Darren, and he wouldn't spare me a dime if I was starving." "Mr." Sterling looked directly at me, his expression softening with genuine understanding. "May I come in, Mr. Vance? I assure you, this concerns you very much." I stepped aside, and he entered, his expensive shoes clicking softly on my cheap linoleum. He didn't flinch at the sight of my air mattress, the makeshift curtain, or the stack of unpaid bills sitting on my card table. He simply opened his briefcase, a moment that felt like the entire world was holding its breath, and pulled out a stack of documents. Mr. Finch, as you know, was the night janitor at the City General. What you didn't know is that Mr. Finch spent his entire life working. He wasn't poor by circumstance, he was humble by choice. Mr. Sterling paused for dramatic effect, letting the gravity of the moment settle. He was a brilliant industrial designer. Over the decades, Mr. Finch acquired 17 active patents for specialized orthopedic and surgical devices, specifically related to soft tissue procedures. I gripped the back of my folding chair. My mind was reeling. The quiet man who fixed my charger, the guy who gave me old books on patent law. His inventions have saved thousands of lives. Mr. Vance. And the licensing fees generated over the years resulted in a substantial estate. After all taxes and deductions, Mr. Finch has left his entire fortune to you. Mr. Sterling pushed a bank document across the card table, his finger resting next to the number. $93 million. The figure didn't register as money. It registered as a violent, impossible collision between the cold, calculated cruelty of my past and the absurd, overwhelming generosity of a stranger. My legs gave out, and I sank heavily into the folding chair, the metal creaking under the weight of the impossible truth. 93 million, enough to buy my parents' business 10 times over. Mr. Sterling handed me a thick, worn journal. Mr. Finch left very specific instructions. He wanted you to know that he saw you every night. He saw the boy fighting for his life while still trying to earn enough to pay the bills. He saw your resilience. Your mother and father calculated your demise on a spreadsheet. Mr. Finch recorded your strength in this journal. I opened the journal to a page marked with a dried flower. I could barely read the shaky script through the sudden blur of tears. The Vance boy is a fighter. They call him a financial liability. But his hands are gold. He doesn't know it. but I've been quietly covering his antibiotic copays for months. He doesn't know his value, but I do. It's immeasurable. He must live. My heart broke. He didn't just see me. He was secretly paying for me to live. He was fighting the Vance family's calculus with quiet, powerful generosity. There is one condition. Mr. Sterling continued softly. Mr. Finch explicitly stated that since your worth was questioned by those who should have loved you, you must establish the Silas Finch Foundation for medically abandoned patients. He wanted you to use this money to prove, once and for all, that no life should ever be deemed too expensive to save. I held the journal against my chest, sobbing for the kind old man who had chosen me, the discarded asset, to be the steward of his incredible legacy. He was the watchman. He was the angel. And he had just handed me the biggest, most beautiful weapon against the calculated cruelty of my past. The reckoning was here. The weight of the inheritance wasn't the number. It was the responsibility. I didn't want the money to change me into the kind of person my father was, a man whose worth was defined by his bank account. I wanted it to change the world my father believed in. The first thing I did was call Gina Morales. I didn't call her to gloat. I called her to partner. Gina, I said, my voice thick with emotion when she answered. We did it. Mr. Finch left me everything. I need you to be the executive director of the Silas Finch Foundation. She thought I was pulling her leg. When she realized I was serious, I heard her cry for the first time. The woman who never showed weakness, the one who taught me to fight, was overwhelmed. We weren't just going to pay off my debt. We were going to demolish the toxic math that destroyed families. Our mission was to dismantle the lie that human life is ever too expensive to save. The paperwork was overwhelming, but with Mr. Sterling's firm handling the logistics, we launched the foundation within weeks. The first thing we did was simple. We targeted patients in the charity care program who had been medically abandoned by their families. We paid off their debt, provided housing during treatment, and offered counseling to help them realize their worth. The news hit the Denver financial wires like a bomb. Janitor's $93 million fortune establishes foundation for medically abandoned patients. The reporters quickly connected the dots. The cancer survivor, the son of the prominent auto shop owner, Robert Vance, who was abandoned 5 years prior. It didn't take long for the inevitable call. The number was blocked, but I knew. It was their new number, the one they probably reserved for clients and heirs. I took a deep breath. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about drawing a clear, final boundary. I answered, "Hello, Darren. My brother, the golden child," started with the rehearsed script. "Colt, thank God. We've been trying to reach you. Look, Mom and Dad are beside themselves. We heard the news. We are so happy for you. We just want to apologize, okay? We were scared. It was a mistake. Family forgives, right? We want to reconcile." I let the silence hang there, heavy and intentional. Then my father, Robert Vance, grabbed the phone, his voice laced with the old authority, though now tinged with pathetic desperation. "Son, listen to me. This foundation is a fine gesture, but you're being emotional. You have more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. We are your blood. Charity starts at home. We made a tough choice, but we're prepared to make reparations. We need to talk about bringing this money back into the family." That was the moment. He still saw the money as a Vance asset. He hadn't changed at all. "You're right, Dad," I said, my voice calm, steady, and utterly cold. "We need to talk about family. You taught me that family is determined by investment. You looked at a sick 19-year-old and calculated I was a loss. You traded me for the house and Darren's future. You called me a financial liability, and my mother said, 'Let him die.'" My mother started crying loudly in the background, a theatrical, calculated sob.
We were just protecting the family. Eli, we were terrified. No, I corrected, my voice rising just slightly. You were protecting your assets. There's a difference. Let me tell you who my family is now. Gina Morales is my family. She saved my life with a binder full of solutions. The nurses who held my hand through the worst chemo nights are my family. The strangers whose debts I'm paying off, they are my family. I paused, letting the final truth sink in. And the man who paid for all of this? The man who saw the gold in my hands when you only saw red ink? Mr. Silas Finch, the janitor who made minimum wage and fixed my laptop charger. He is my family. He was worth $93 million, and he chose to leave every penny to the person you declared too expensive to save. You're making a mistake. We'll sue. We'll fight for the business, my father roared, his mask of contrition finally shattering into pure greed. You taught me that a life is defined by its work. Dad, Mr. Finch's work saved thousands of lives through his patents, and now his legacy is saving thousands more from financial ruin. Your work destroyed your son for a house you now realize you can't buy happiness with. I finished the conversation cleanly. You're my blood relatives. You taught me the difference. Goodbye. I hung up and blocked the number permanently. Today, the Silas Finch Foundation is a success. We've paid off millions, ensuring that no patient has to choose between treatment and their apartment. I keep Mr. Finch's worn patent law books and his janitor ID badge on my desk. They remind me that the greatest wealth isn't measured by a bank account, but by the compassion you choose to invest in humanity. I was once an asset, then a liability, but thanks to a quiet stranger, I am finally free. I learned that your worth is not a calculation. It is a fundamental truth. And the only people who truly matter are the ones who see that truth when you have absolutely nothing left. If you know what it's like to be discarded, to be told you're too expensive to save, please like this video. If the cruel calculus of the Vance family hit close to home, comment below with your city and tell me who the unexpected angel in your life was. And here's the most important part. Subscribe to this channel. When you subscribe, you join a community where we share the powerful, true stories of underdogs who fought back against greed, who found justice, and who proved that your life is priceless. We're not just telling stories, we're fighting the toxic math of the world. One truth at a time. Join the fight. Don't miss the next chapter.